It is 1977. A steelworker named Joe walks out of Youngstown Sheet and Tube for the last time. He is 42 years old. He started working here right out of high school, just like his father before him. He bought a house on his wages, raised 3 kids, and sent 2 of them to college. His pension was supposed to kick in at 55. Now the mill is closing, and 5,000 jobs are vanishing overnight. Joe does not know it yet, but he is living through the opening chapter of one of the most catastrophic economic collapses in American history. What he also does not know is that everything he will be told about what comes next will be a lie. This is the story of how the Rust Belt was dismantled, the promises that were made, and why the damage is permanent. If you enjoy videos like these, subscribe. For nearly a century, the Rust Belt was the industrial backbone of America. Stretching from western New York through Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, and into Wisconsin, this region produced the steel, automobiles, rubber, glass, and machinery that literally built modern America. These were not just factories, they were the furnaces that forged the Allied victory in World War II. Cities like Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, Youngstown, Gary, and Buffalo were not just prosperous. They represented the apex of American industrial might, proof that capitalism could deliver the good life to working people without college degrees. The promise was simple, and it was real. A high school graduate could walk into a steel mill or auto plant, get hired, and join a strong union. He would earn enough to buy a house and support a family on a single income. He would have health care, a pension, and enough left over to send his kids to college. He would retire with dignity. This was not just an economic arrangement. It was the foundation of entire communities, the source of identity and pride, the backbone of the American middle class. Then it started to fall apart. The collapse began in the 1970s and accelerated like a landslide through the 1980s and the 1990s. Global competition arrived from rebuilt post-war economies in Japan and Germany, with newer, more efficient factories. The oil shocks of the 1970s devastated American auto manufacturers who had grown fat and complacent. Corporations made cold calculations and relocated production to the anti-union South, or shipped entire factories overseas where labor was cheaper. Automation eliminated jobs by the thousands. Management failed to innovate, and workers paid the price. Between 1979 and 1988, the steel industry alone hemorrhaged over 400,000 jobs. But this was not presented as the catastrophe it would become. Americans were told a very different story. The politicians and economists had an explanation ready. This was temporary pain for long-term gain. America was transitioning to a knowledge economy, a service economy that would be even more prosperous than what came before. Workers just needed to be patient through the adjustment period. The future was bright if people could just hang on. That adjustment period never ended. It's been over 40 years and most Rust Belt communities are still waiting for the prosperity to arrive. There was no transition, just permanent decline. But don't worry, they said, retraining will solve everything. This was the mantra before learn to code became a punchline. Workers were told they could be retrained for the new economy. Programs were announced, funding was allocated, and politicians made speeches about investing in America's workers. It sounded great on paper. The reality was brutal. Retraining programs had success rates under 20%. It turns out you cannot easily turn a 50-year-old steelworker into a computer programmer or a healthcare technician. The jobs often were not there anyway, and the scale of retraining was absurdly inadequate for the scale of job loss. It was like bringing a bucket to fight a forest fire. Worse, many of these programs were outright scams that enriched for-profit training companies, while leaving workers with worthless certificates and debt they would never be able to repay. Then came the trade deals. NAFTA and other agreements were sold as net positives that would create better, higher-paying jobs, even as some manufacturing work moved abroad. Americans were promised that export opportunities would more than make up for any losses. Those promised jobs never materialized in Rust Belt communities. Instead, workers watched their factories literally disassembled and shipped to Mexico or China. Trade adjustment assistance was a pittance. The new jobs that did appear paid half as much, with none of the benefits. The service economy is the future, they insisted. Manufacturing jobs were framed as old-fashioned relics. Future belonged to services, information work, and the creative class. For workers without college degrees in these regions, the service economy meant one thing: working at Walmart for $10 an hour instead of making $25 an hour with benefits at the plant. You cannot raise a family on that. You cannot buy a house or build wealth on service sector wages. And those service jobs were not even showing up in Rust Belt towns. They went to suburbs and cities. Why does the gap between promises and reality matter so much? Because people did everything they were supposed to do. They worked hard, played by the rules, and built their communities. They were told the system would work for them. When it catastrophically did not, they were not offered help or accountability. They were blamed for not being flexible enough, for not adapting fast enough. Meanwhile, the people making these promises, the economists and politicians and corporate executives, were insulated from the consequences. They got richer during globalization. Their kids were not the ones watching their towns die. The false optimism they peddled meant inadequate responses and decades lost that could never be recovered. The Standard story treats this as simple job loss. It was not. When a major factory closed, it did not just eliminate those direct jobs, it killed everything connected to them. The suppliers went under. The machine shops and tool and die makers had no customers. Transportation companies had nothing to haul. The lunch counters where workers ate had no one to serve. Retail stores closed. The tax base that funded schools and services evaporated. A single major plant closure could trigger a cascading regional depression. The economic multiplier effect that had built these communities now worked in reverse, tearing them apart. The social fabric disintegrated in ways that spreadsheets and unemployment statistics could never capture. These were communities built around stable employment where multiple generations worked at the same plants. Your identity and your social networks were tied to your workplace and your union. The collapse did not just take jobs. It destroyed the organizational structures that had given working-class communities political power and social cohesion. Unions, churches, civic organizations all withered. The psychological impact was devastating, watching your life's work become obsolete, being unable to provide for your family the way your parents provided for you, seeing skills you had spent decades mastering suddenly worthless. This created a profound despair that manifested in substance abuse, family breakdown, and what researchers now call deaths of despair. The demographic collapse tells its own horror story. Detroit lost over 60% of its population from its peak. Youngstown lost 60%. Gary lost 55%. Entire neighborhoods were abandoned, block after block of empty houses left to rot. The brain drain made it permanent. The talented young people who could leave did leave. They pursued education and opportunities elsewhere, and they did not come back. This drained these regions of the human capital needed for any hope of renewal, and left behind aging populations with fewer skills and resources. As tax bases collapsed, municipalities could not maintain basic infrastructure. Roads crumbled, water systems failed, Schools deteriorated. Public services vanished. Flint's water crisis is the most visible example of this infrastructure decay. An entire city's children were poisoned because the depleted government could not afford proper water treatment. This infrastructure debt will cost hundreds of billions to repair, and it creates daily hardship that compounds every other problem. Then the opioid epidemic arrived, and it hit Rust Belt communities with particular ferocity. It found places already devastated by economic despair and stripped of the community institutions that might have provided resistance or support. Pharmaceutical companies targeted these regions explicitly, seeing vulnerable populations ripe for exploitation. Death rates from drugs, alcohol, and suicide in these areas reached levels typically seen in war zones. The collapse had created the perfect conditions for another catastrophe. The damage is multi-generational and self-reinforcing. The children who grew up during the collapse in the 1980s and 1990s faced reduced educational opportunities, as collapsing tax bases meant failing schools. They witnessed family instability and substance abuse. They inherited neither wealth nor the social capital that comes from stable communities. Now they have raised their own children in these same depleted environments. A second generation has been shaped by economic hopelessness, with no memory of what prosperity looked like. The loss of institutional knowledge is permanent. The skilled trades, the engineering expertise, the manufacturing know-how that took a century to develop is simply gone. The workers who possessed it retired or died. The apprenticeship systems that transmitted knowledge from one generation to the next collapsed. Even if the United States wanted to rebuild domestic manufacturing capacity now, we would struggle because we have lost the human capital to do it. The decline feeds itself in a vicious cycle. Businesses do not locate in declining regions, which causes further decline and makes investment even less attractive. Banks do not lend. Young people leave. Property values collapse. Crime increases. Services deteriorate. Breaking this cycle requires massive coordinated investment that has not materialized and likely never will. The political consequences have reshaped America in ways we are still discovering. The Rust Belt collapse created a large population that felt betrayed by the economic and political establishment. Both parties supported the trade deals and policies that facilitated deindustrialization. This sense of abandonment fundamentally realigned American politics. These regions, once democratic strongholds built on union membership, became swing territory and eventually the foundation of Trump's base. The 2016 election, Brexit, and the rise of populist movements globally are directly connected to grievances created by deindustrialization. Perhaps most dangerous is the credibility collapse. When people watched every promise get broken, every assurance prove false, and every expert prediction turn out wrong, they stopped trusting institutions entirely. If elites were completely wrong about deindustrialization and showed no accountability for the devastation, why believe them about anything? This helps explain vaccine hesitancy, conspiracy thinking, and the broader epistemic crisis tearing America apart. The fundamental lie was that there was a plan, that someone was in control, that the transition would be managed. There was no plan. No one was managing anything. Corporations made decisions based on quarterly profits. Policymakers responded to donor interests. Working-class communities were sacrificed to abstract economic theories. And when it all went catastrophically wrong, those same elites shrugged and blamed the victims for not adapting fast enough. That betrayal echoes louder today than it did 40 years ago. The Rust Belt collapse demonstrates that market transitions are not automatically beneficial, even if they create aggregate efficiency gains. The human and social costs can be catastrophic and permanent for the communities involved. The lack of a serious policy response, no massive retraining programs that actually worked, and no infrastructure investment at the scale of the problem represents one of the great policy failures in American history. The effects are still unfolding: political instability, regional inequality, loss of social mobility, public health crises. These are ongoing consequences of decisions made 40 years ago. The Rust Belt did not just decline. It was actively dismantled, and what replaced it has proven incapable of providing the stability, dignity, or prosperity that working-class people once had. The costs are still being paid and will be for generations to come. Subscribe for more videos.